Good morning, everybody, or I guess afternoon, evening, whenever you happen to be listening to this. Hopefully, you're having a good day so far. Our topic this time around is going to be the presidency, in charge of the executive branch. So before we get into our topic proper, again, as usual, please take a moment and think about some of the things that the president of the U.S. does today, whatever it is. Just kind of think of a few things, if you would. All right. So whatever things you thought of, chances are very high that it is something that early presidents didn't get involved in. We are going to see today how the presidency has evolved to come to be one of the most central figures in the United States government and society as a whole. Um, we are focusing on the presidency today, right? The presidency as part of the executive branch, but the executive branch itself also includes a whole bunch of bureaucracy and other things like that. So we're for purposes of this class, we're going to separate those two things apart, and today we'll largely focus on just this one particular office. So just a quick reminder at the top here, we've got this concept of separation of powers, where the Constitution divides the big old bucket of governmental powers into three separate branches. We've got the legislative, judicial, and then today's executive. So the head of the executive is the president. Currently, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. And we'll see over the coming slides that the president is sort of a very unique position in the United States of America insofar as how it operates and the sorts of powers and particular things that it gets involved in. Right, so it's a very unique office. But before we get into some of those things, let's take a look at a few of the qualifications. To be president, you've got to be 35 years old. You have to be a natural U.S. born citizen, and you have to have lived in the United States for at least 14 years. So we've talked a little bit about Congress and their requirements before as far as age and things like that go. So I wanted to just lay them all out so we can compare them real quick. The president, we'll see, has a higher minimum age. The president is also the only elected official in the United States where it is constitutionally required that they be born a citizen, right? Any other elected office, for Senate, House of Representatives, for governors, for mayors, for things like that, almost always the requirement is just simply that you're a citizen. And there might be some length requirement on there as well, like you have to have been a citizen for 7 years or 9 years, as we're seeing here. Um, and also we see a very long residency requirement, right? We want somebody who has been here for 14 years or so. So I'm going to kind of pose the question that's over onto the right. Why do you think that these differences were established? And I'll give you a moment to consider some options. One of the guiding reasons that the founders set this bar for entrance much higher is for a number of reasons tied specifically to the powers of the president itself. We'll see in a moment that the presidency has a very strong role in foreign policy, so going out and being sort of the face of the United States to the whole rest of the world. Um, and the president is also was even though it's the presidency itself has grown vastly from what the founders imagined, the president was seen as sort of the head cog in this machine, and so you would need to have some experience in dealing with people, some understanding of how to implement whatever it is that Congress is telling you to do. So they wanted to have somebody with a bit more experience under their belt, and also somebody who is very keenly aware of what America was like. We'll see in a moment that the president is the only representative, or excuse me, the only person elected to represent the entire nation. So we want them to have a good idea of the nation as a whole. As far as term length, presidents are allowed to serve for 4-year terms, and under the original Constitution, they could be elected as many times as the good people of the United States wanted to. This George Washington, our first president, set the precedent and the tradition of only serving for 2 years, right? So presidents from Washington all the way through the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt excuse me, was our president, they all observed a two-term limit. President Roosevelt, though, he found himself elected for 4 separate times. So he died before the end of his 4th term. He died in office, and that's when Harry Truman took over, and it was Harry Truman who sort of wrapped up World War II. It was Truman's decision to, for example, drop the 2 atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan. But anyway, so after that point, the 22nd Amendment was passed, and this limited the number of terms a president could serve to simply 2 terms. So that would be 8 years, but in one very, very, very specific case, you could, in theory, serve up to 10 years. So if you are the vice president, and then the president dies, maybe in their 3rd year of office, so you have 1 year of the first president of the previous president's term, and then you yourself could be elected up to 2 times as president in your own right. However, if the president dies, say in their 1st year, then that term, even though you're only serving for 2 years, even though you're only serving for 3 years, that counts as one of your 2 constitutionally allotted terms. So if it's less than 2 years left that you have to serve, it doesn't count as one of yours. But if it's more than 2 years, then it has to count as one of them. The Constitution also explicitly mentions a vice president, right? And under the Constitution, the vice president had 2 jobs, and that was it. Primarily, they were to sit around and wait for the president to die. There were a number of concerns that, hey, these presidents, they're probably going to be a little bit older. They've got a stressful job. We should have some sort of contingency plan in place. And so let's get a vice president, somebody to kind of step up and easily take over the reins of government. Their other constitutional appointed role is to serve as the president of the Senate. And in the Congress lesson, we talk a little bit about that. But very, very quickly, vice presidents realize, like, God, I can't do anything. I'm just sitting around. I can't even talk. I can't vote except in cases of a tie, and that rarely ever happens. So rather than doing all that, they will oftentimes leave the seat of the president of the Senate to the president pro tem, which again is a position that comes up in the Congress lesson. Over time, though, vice presidents have come to take on a much more powerful role in government as a whole. Sometimes they will spearhead areas that the president themselves really, really care about, and so kind of putting essentially the number 2 person in charge sends a pretty powerful message that, hey, this thing is important, so you need to kind of figure out what's going on. I mentioned a little while ago that the executive branch has a few very, very unique features, and how exactly those features were crafted is one of the causes behind the presidency itself being the 2nd most debated topic at the Constitutional Convention, right? The first one obviously being the Congress and how representation was going to look in practice. But there's 2 features that we're going to look at, and the first is that the president is a unitary executive. So unitary, think unicycle, so one wheel. And the unitary executive is also often contrasted with the plural executive. So what exactly that means, we'll get into right now. So a unitary, again, unicycle, one wheel, one person. The executive branch is headed by the president and sort of also the vice president. And it's up to the president in particular, but these 2 folks in more in a general sense, to lead the entirety of the executive branch, right? So they are the ones who are in charge. To help them carry out this role, there is a branch of the executive known as the cabinet. Pardon me. The cabinet, we'll talk a little bit more about today, is sort of the heads of all of the major departments, and there are currently 15 cabinet positions, and again, they're each in charge of massive areas of the federal bureaucracy. So we've got all those folks, things like Department of Homeland Security, Department of the Interior, Department of Transportation, massive, massive things. Um, Also, under the House of the Executive Branch are a number of regulatory agencies that go around and enforce laws. So things like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that also help to ensure that pollution is kept to certain limits and doesn't go above that, and make sure that our food is clean, and there aren't the people that are working in processing facilities are being sanitary. Both the cabinet and all these regulatory agencies are tasked with enforcing the laws, helping to carry out the laws that, at least in theory, Congress creates. This idea of the unitary executive comes in because the president is in charge of all of these things. So it's a very wide-reaching position, and the president is the one person in charge of all of this. Hence, like unitary, unicycle, one person, one wheel. Right? President's at the top there. The second major unique feature we're going to look at for the presidency is how they come to be elected, and their election is a very unique one in large part because, again, they're the only person, the only voice that speaks on behalf of the entire country. That is both the people and the state. So all of the United States is, again, theoretically, represented by the president. Compare that with the Senate, who represents a state or a member in the House of Representatives, right? So District 22, where San Jacinto is, represented by currently Pete Olson, and who knows, after the November elections in 2020, those individuals speak for very tiny sections of the country, whereas the president says, no, we are going to speak for the whole country. So to help make sure that everyone's voice is more encompassed by this office, the Constitution creates the Electoral College, and we'll spend some more time looking at this institution later in the semester. But kind of quick rundown is that on election day, whenever the president is up for re-election or election, there's a popular vote by states. So Texas, right? All of Texas votes are kind of pooled together, and the Texas votes are separate from Louisiana votes, which are separate from California votes, right? So they're all in their own little states. And depending on how a state votes, that state selects a number of electors, and then the electors themselves will, usually about a month or so after the November election, the electors will meet in what's known as the Electoral College. And it is those electors who then cast a ballot for a president. And almost always, whoever the state voted a majority for, almost always those electors vote according to what the wishes of that particular state. So if Texas voted for the Republican candidate in 2016, so all of Texas's electors voted for the Republican candidate in 2016, and that was Donald Trump. Whoever wins a majority of the Electoral College then becomes the president. And if there is a tie, or if nobody gets a majority, which has happened a couple of times in our history, then the House of Representatives steps in to make that decision. So again, two-step process, right? Popular vote by the states to choose electors, and then step two is that the Electoral College meets and sort of actually selects the full-on president. Initially, the president and vice president were voted for separately in the Electoral College. So there would be a ballot like, okay, let's vote for the president. And then the next time around, okay, now let's vote for the vice president. As you can imagine, this might create a very, very bad situation. And give you a few seconds, think about what might happen. Well, what could happen is that the first place, for example, might win the presidency, so that person gets the president. And then when it comes time to vote for the vice president, well, maybe you get your political opponent elected in as your vice president. To get around that potentiality, the 12th Amendment was passed. This was a really early amendment, and at this point in time, now electors vote for a president and vice president together. So in 2016, folks were voting for Trump and Pence at the same time, if that is in fact who they opted to vote for. So again, we've got the executive as a unitary office, as a unitary branch, right, with one person in charge of the entirety of the branch. And again, there's a lot of checks in place and things like that. But for all intents and purposes, one person in charge. And that one person is selected via a very unique method, and that is the Electoral College. So having gotten through some of the institutional requirements and setups, we'll look briefly at the past of the presidency, and a lot of scholars will break the history of the presidency into three distinct phases. We've got early presidents, middle presidents, and modern presidents, and you can see the years spaced out there, so we'll spend about a slide or so on each of these. The early presidents are going to be the first three: Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. These folks are all credited with kind of establishing the presidency as an institution. They all worked to strengthen the role of the federal government, excuse me, to shore up the place of the federal government in society in this under this new constitution. So each of these three presidents are sort of seen as I don't, I don't want to say groundbreaking or pioneering, because none of them would see themselves as such, but they were tasked with doing something entirely new. So even something as simple as, well, what are you going to call the president? Is this going to be His Highness? Is this going to be the first citizen of the United States? Is it going to be whatever? That all had something as simple as that housekeeping matter had to be figured out. And so Washington himself decided on Mr. President or President of the United States, right? And there were some that were going so far as to essentially equate the presidency with a monarchy. And so you had to figure these things out. You had to figure out how the president was going to be in charge, right? So these are all pretty important insofar as setting up traditions and norms and expectations of this particular presidency. That being said, all three of these individuals saw themselves as still clerks, right? They saw themselves as being very tied to the Congress, right? You'll recall the Constitution gives the bulk of governing power not to the president, right? Because folks were afraid of a monarchy, but they gave the bulk of the power at the federal government to Congress. And if it was seen as Congress's job to debate and discuss and make the laws, and then the president's job to carry out the law. And to be more specific, the president was to carry out the law as given to him by Congress. So this idea that Washington could put his own little spin on a law, or that Jefferson might be able to kind of create law on his own. That was just nowhere near their minds, and they weren't thinking like that. So the fact that we have presidents today who do think that, right? This is a very far jump from how these early office holders saw their position. Moving on. After those early presidents, we've got a long period of kind of weaker presidents. Again, they're allowing Congress, I shouldn't say allowing, they are just kind of following their job, and they see that Congress has the upper hand, that Congress is the branch that should be kind of directing the federal government. And again, that makes sense because Congress is the branch that's closest to you and me, closest to the people, and most representative of the people. So Congress should be the one kind of calling the shots, and then presidents follow suit. We do as Congress tells us to do. We are just kind of a bureaucrat, right? Stamping papers and making sure paychecks get sent home, right? That important thing. A couple exceptions during this period was Andrew Jackson, who was a heavily populist individual. He often found himself in bitter disputes with Congress and much of the rest of the nation, to be quite honest. And Abraham Lincoln also found himself in conflict with much of the nation, and at least until half of that nation left. but the conflict still was there. So Abraham Lincoln served during the Civil War and almost saw and was killed right at the very very end of that conflict. A lot of folks will see Lincoln and Jackson as acting almost tyrannical in terms of the powers that they took on to themselves, and there's certainly a real argument to be made there. I'm happy to kind of go into more detail if anybody has any thoughts on that. So please shoot me an email. Let me know. Finally, we're getting into the modern presidency, and here we see this guy again, right? Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was the guy who was crucial in transitioning the styles of federalism from that traditional federalism into that cooperative federalism during the time of the Great Depression, New Deal, moving into World War II, right? So it's not surprising that this individual is very involved in this transition to a more modern president. And we'll see that modern presidents take on huge amounts of power relative to earlier ones. So they're much more involved in the overall decision making, budget setting, and as we'll see later on today, even making war. So taking on a number of roles that are explicitly given to Congress, but now the presidents are the ones who are exercising it. So in a few slides down the way, we'll see sort of how that took place. But suffice it to say that the presidency has become much more powerful relative to its earlier roots and relative to what the Constitution had envisioned for it. With that, I'm going to pause and we'll jump into our next section.